Hi, welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be talking about Disney's new television series, The Book of Boba Fett. I'm very excited to talk about this television show, not because I was excited to watch it, but just because I love being right, even though I don't have really anything to compare it to. I've actually attempted to sit down and write all of my thoughts out, because every time I try to sit down and film this video, I've just come off like a crazy lunatic that just rants for 30 minutes about nothing. I'm going to try to do my best to keep my thoughts and opinions on this as organized and coherent as possible. And if it doesn't end up working out that well, then I apologize in advance. Spoiler alert, if you have not seen the television show and you are just absolutely dying to watch it without any spoilers whatsoever, then turn off this until you watch it and then maybe come back and watch and give me a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Otherwise, yeah, that's all I have to say really, and let's get started. Let me just, I've tried filming this part like 17 times. I've tried writing out a script with all of my feelings. I've tried doing bullet points. I've tried doing everything possible, and I end up just kind of rambling incoherently about things. So I'm going to try to keep this as concise as possible so I don't lose my voice before I get into the actual review of the show. Here's the thing. I would consider myself to be a Star Wars fan, but probably be more accurate if you would call me a Star Wars fan if you put like 30 asterisks next to the word fan. I grew up watching the original trilogy. Back then, those were the only 3 films that existed, you know, back in the dark ages. And I really loved them for a lot of the same reasons that other people liked the original films. Great characters, there's a wonderful focused story that for the time was groundbreaking and different and creative and fun. Really surprisingly good cinematography and special effects that even though they were made in the 70s were like groundbreaking and still hold their own today. I consider them to be 3 of my favorites of all time to this day. I used to walk around my house quoting Return of the Jedi at my family to the point where I'm surprised they didn't leave me at the grocery store by accident because I was so annoying about it. And over the years, I think my emotional attachment and appreciation for those 3 films has kept me interested enough to watch the major films when they're released in the franchise and tune into The Mandalorian because I had a coworker that would bother me every single day that I came into work to have me watch it until I finally did. So I would say that I know probably more than your average random person on the street about at least the film canon and The Mandalorian. As far as the expanded universe and all of that goes, I don't really have anything more than a very superficial knowledge of the main points. I've tried reading some of the books before. I found them very uninteresting and I never picked them up again. The thing that I have such a hard time with Star Wars is that there's just so much content out there. The franchise is so oversaturated with content to the point where it's overwhelming, and also none of it's very interesting to me. It seems like a lot of the content, at least in my opinion, that has been released under the Star Wars umbrella since those 3 films have really just rode on the coattails of the fact that the original 3 films were really popular and haven't really put a ton of effort into making anything actually new or interesting or creative or just fun to watch. It's very referential to the same things we've seen over and over again. We revisit the same characters, the same plots, the same sets, the same everything, and a lot of the same Star Wars tropes too, without actually doing anything creative, which is really ironic to me because the original 3 films were so successful in large part because of how creative and groundbreaking they were for the time. And now we just regurgitate the same shit over and over again. It's like Star Wars is now a revolving door of Skywalkers, stormtroopers, bounty hunters, lifting things up with the Force, the Millennium Falcon, and the Emperor using Force lightning to kill people. That is not to say that you can't refer to things that you've already seen or things that have already been established. There's plenty of examples out there of movies and television shows that take something that we already know, maybe it's a character, maybe it's an event, and explore a different perspective on it, and they do so in a very successful way. The whole problem when you do something like that, when you refer to something we already know, is you have to do it for a reason. You have to give us a new perspective, a new understanding, give us something to take out of this so we're not walking away from it being why the fuck did I even just waste my time? It has to answer the age-old question, so fucking what? And I feel a lot of times with Star Wars, it doesn't really answer the question. It just refers to something because it can, and because it can slap the Star Wars logo on it, and people will watch it because it takes place in the Star Wars universe. There's been some exceptions to that. There's been shows and parts of movies that I did find entertaining or I did find interesting or that had potential, but ultimately I think Star Wars is just kind of coasting on the fact that it can make content about whatever it wants and that people will watch it no matter what. So it has to have a purpose. And I think with Star Wars, the main problem is that it doesn't really know the difference between things that you should make a story about, things that are worthwhile, there's a story there, there's a reason, there's something that you can latch on to explore and give a new perspective, and things that you could technically make a story about, but you probably shouldn't. Not everything deserves a story, which brings me to Boba Fett. Now, I said this before, I'm going to say it right now, I will continue to say it for the rest of my life, and I will probably have it etched on my gravestone. Boba Fett is a plot device. Was Boba Fett an important part of The Empire Strikes Back? Yes. He was somebody that was able to get the characters to meet at a certain location in the third act of the film to get the main conflict and the climax of the film to move forward. It doesn't feel like he's a plot device because he was well designed and he said cool things and they did so in a clever way to incorporate it into the plot without making it feel like that's what was happening, but that's the reality of what was happening. Like, yes, he was cool. Yes, he was an interesting little like nugget that they included in the film, but that doesn't make him in and of itself an important character in this larger story. And the fact that Han Solo killed him by turning around too fast with a stick should speak to the fact that he's not supposed to be very important. It annoys me that this franchise has gotten into a habit of trying to make everything that happened in the original films important somehow and part of this larger story, and that's exactly what they did with Boba Fett by incorporating him into the prequel lore and making him this overinflated level of importance by making him the unaltered clone of the man from whom the most inept group of stormtroopers was ever cloned. And they do it just because they can, because they want to reference Boba Fett, because people like Boba Fett, not because it'll make the story better or more coherent or like more, interesting. Does seeing Boba Fett as a child saying pew 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 when he's riding around in Slave One make us more appreciative of his character? No. And so yeah, maybe they could make an interesting story about Boba Fett. Maybe they could like add some more dimension to him and like give him more of a backstory so we further understand him as a character. Maybe they could do that. But I knew as soon as they released it that they weren't going to. The end credit scene from The Mandalorian told me everything that I needed to know about what to expect from the show, and for the most part I was correct. So that's like where I'm coming from. I know that that sounds really annoying, and I know that there are a lot of people that do enjoy the fact that Star Wars does a ton of these like, explanations of different things that happen to the characters that they like, and I know that's fine, and you're completely entitled to like what you like. But for me, I don't really care about the Star Wars lore. I just want to be entertained, and I don't want to see the same shit over and over again with a different title, as if Star Wars is like pulling a fast one on us by making us think that they're actually putting out new content. So yeah, that's all I have to say about that. Now let's talk about the show. Hello, so it's a new day, and I am here with my 7 or 8 pages of notes behind me on my monitor so that I can make sure that I get all of the salient details correct, so I just want to make sure I get all my shit straight before I start talking and ripping into this show. So I mentioned a couple seconds ago about how I knew when I watched the end credit scene from The Mandalorian Season 2 that I was not going to like the Book of Boba Fett, and here is why. So if you don't remember the end credit scene, essentially it shows Boba Fett and his friend Fennec Shan, I'll call her Shan. Boba Fett and Shan go back to Jabba's palace in this end credit scene, and Boba Fett essentially shoots everybody and decides to take his place on the throne to replace Jabba the Hutt. Bib Fortuna, Jabba the Hutt's executive secretary or whoever was like helping him in Return of the Jedi, has been operating this criminal empire in between when Jabba was killed and now, which is like 5 years later. And Boba Fett promptly kills him and takes his place on the throne, and that's what we see for the end credit scene. So my question when I was watching this, because I was obviously like horrified and confused, was wait a second, Bib Fortuna died already. What the fuck is he doing running this criminal empire? He was on the sail barge that blew up in Return of the Jedi. How the fuck is he here now? And you could say, okay Megan, maybe he got out, maybe he was able to escape once he saw things going south. Maybe we'll explore this when they inevitably release the Book of Bib Fortuna in a couple years on Disney Plus. No one is allowed to die according to Disney's Star Wars standards. No one is allowed to die. Remember Darth Maul? Remember when he got cut in half and lost his fucking torso? Just kidding, in Solo: A Star Wars Story he has robotic legs. Oh, remember when Boba Fett was supposed to get eaten by a Sarlacc pit monster? Just kidding, he managed to escape. Remember when Darth Vader had that amazing sacrifice and redemption point at the end of Return of the Jedi when he threw the Emperor into that giant space garbage disposal and essentially disintegrated him? Just kidding, that was either a clone or he somehow managed to survive that. Fuck you, Disney. Rather than introducing some random person who came in and decided to take over Jabba's criminal empire. Disney felt like it had to go back to somebody that we already know, somebody that is related to Jabba in some way. We felt like we had to do that rather than introducing somebody different, but at the cost of continuity and the cost of like, wait a second, this person is probably not actually alive. Why the fuck are they there? And that's something that Disney does all the time. People need to die in these shows. So going into this show, I was not particularly jazzed. Now I feel like I also have to mention Boba Fett's involvement in The Mandalorian because he was referenced and I think was included in like 1 or 2 episodes. I was a little bit like, when I saw Boba Fett included in Mandalorian. However, I wasn't quite as annoyed as I thought I would be, mainly because A, he was a very small part of it, and B, he seemed pretty consistent with what I would expect his character to be based on the 4 or 5 speaking lines that he's had in the past in this film franchise. He wasn't necessarily redeemed, but he wasn't this antagonist that we usually associate him with, so it was an interesting little twist to have him be somebody that was on the same side as someone that we're rooting for. But other than that, I mean, he wasn't really like a huge part of it. He was just kind of there, and I didn't really think too much of it one way or the other until, of course, the end credit scene. So without getting into spoilers too quickly, I would say it's definitely not the worst show. That would probably be How I Met Your Father or Saved by the Bell. It pretty much it met my expectations almost exactly. There were pretty decent special effects. It was horribly referential to things that we've already seen in the Star Wars franchise. Pretty boring, kind of slow paced. The character wasn't terribly interesting. It overall attempted to achieve what The Mandalorian did successfully, or what it was praised for the past 2 seasons, but didn't do so in as much of a successful way. There were some things that surprised me, not necessarily in a good way, but in a way like, I cannot believe I am seeing this right now, I must be hallucinating. There were some things that I probably could have predicted from like a year ago, and there were some things that I am still confused about and losing sleep over to this day. But let's get into the specifics if you don't believe me. So as you can tell, it is now much later in the day by how many string lights that I have on in order to be able to see. Every time I try to open my mouth and formulate sentences, I end up just staring off into the abyss for 20 seconds without making any noise whatsoever. So we're gonna try this again. The weird thing with Boba Fett, with the plot structure in general, is that it mainly jumps back and forth in time between flashbacks and things that are happening in the present. And when I say the present, I mean the events that start off with the Mandalorian end credit scene where Boba Fett takes the throne of Jabba's palace. And this happens about 5 years or so after the events of Return of the Jedi, I think. Don't quote me on that. I don't know anything. I'm just an idiot here on the internet talking about Star Wars. Now, normally I don't mind when shows utilize flashbacks as a way to give context as to what's going on right now, or to just, give a little bit of a variety for the narration of what's going on in the story. However, with the Book of Boba Fett, I found it a little bit annoying when they would do flashbacks, mainly because they were very, very long, and they would insert them in a way that was kind of abrupt, and it wasn't always clear that you were jumping to a flashback. They didn't do anything stylistically with what you're looking at on screen to indicate clearly that you are in a flashback now. Flashbacks would last very, very long, to the point where it would just be like a 30-minute flashback and you completely forgot what was happening in the present. Flashbacks are usually used for the most part in the first couple episodes, so they kind of go away over time. But the fact that the main story is what's taking place in the present, and the flashbacks oftentimes take away from any momentum to establish or further that present story plot, can really detract from your pacing, can really detract from establishing what's going on and having your audience be clear on what's happening. I've created some bullet points of the main plot points of what's going on in the Book of Boba Fett from beginning to end. They're more chronological based on what I've gathered from watching the show, and just also trying to look up summaries online to just get it straight as to what the fuck happened in the show.
I intend to rule with respect.
think it's definitely one thing to have a show that's like a bit of a slow burn, right? I mean, not every show has to start off guns a-blazing, literally guns a-blazing. There's plenty of great shows that start off slow, start off establishing things, and you don't really know what's going to happen, but you're trying to be patient and be invested. And then because of careful planning and good writing, the show rewards you with your patience by having something that really pays off. Mad Men is one of my favorite shows of all time and does this very, very successfully. There are a lot of things that you have no idea will pay off until much later on, and that's because Mad Men has talented writers and they don't work for Disney. I think it's one thing to have a slower plot, but the plot has to work towards something. With the Book of Boba Fett, there really wasn't much to work towards. There wasn't really a story or a focus or an end game that was worth the reward of the slowness and the boringness and the banality of the plot for the first several episodes. There's a lot of scenes where people are sitting around and talking, and they're talking about stuff purely just to deliver information to the audience. But if the audience wasn't there, there's no way that they would be talking about it, because everybody that they're talking to about the particular topic already knows what they're saying and what they're referring to. Like, Star Wars isn't fun and interesting because people are sitting around talking about what they're gonna do. You want to see that shit happening. You want to see that stuff play out in real time. And if the plot is so convoluted that you have to have people constantly sitting and talking about what's happening, then maybe you should fucking revise the plot just a little bit. I also found that there was a bit of a tonal issue. I don't really exactly know what the purpose of it is or what the intended audience was. Obviously, it was meant for people who are fans of Boba Fett, but I don't really even think the writers liked Boba Fett that much. We'll talk about that in a minute. There's a lot of different tones that we've seen in the cinematic canon for Star Wars over the years. I don't really exactly know where this one is supposed to fit in. There wasn't really much charming, fun, humorous, whimsical, clever qualities about this show in general. In fact, I don't think there was one iota of charm anywhere in this television show whatsoever. And that's not to say that every Star Wars film or television show has to be fun and entertaining and lighthearted, but a lot of them are. But if you want to think that this show is trying to go for the more gritty, criminal underworld, more serious approach, and it kind of failed in that regard because there wasn't really good action scenes, mainly because the guy that plays Boba Fett moves around like he's in his early 90s. There wasn't a lot of grittiness or seriousness or intensity that you would expect in a show like that. There was just a lot of people sitting and talking. Who is this meant for? I mean, it almost seems like it's just purely informational. It's not really meant for anybody to enjoy. It's just to deliver information as to what happened, and then you can do with that information what you will. It doesn't mean you're going to enjoy it, but now you know. It's like one of those documentaries from the History Channel where you have people just acting out historical events, and instead of being something significant in Star Wars, it's just this random story about a bounty hunter that doesn't really matter. That's really where I get frustrated again, is because the story doesn't seem to be meant for anyone in particular. It's just meant to do it because it's Boba Fett and we can. One final thing that just kind of like irked me quite a bit while watching this show. This has got to be like the 8th or 9th, I think it's like the 8th time that we've seen Tatooine in the cinematic canon alone. This planet that is not supposed to be important, this planet that was described as being the opposite of the bright center of the universe. It is this nothing place in the middle of nowhere, in the Outer Rim. No one should fucking care about it. And yet, the vast majority of the films and television shows we've already seen somehow incorporate this fucking planet. And Boba Fett really goes over the top by including like 95% of the settings taking place on Tatooine. For being like a science fiction fantasy genre of film and television, the fact that we are wasting this much time on this nothing, ugly, nowhere, depressing planet that is just filled with sand, why can't we do something different? Why couldn't we have had like Jabba also owning another crime empire on one of the other Outer Rim territories? Or maybe just not involve Jabba at all. Maybe just do something completely fucking different. I see another show with Tatooine featured as the predominant location. The plot with Boba Fett is not groundbreaking. It's not rocket science. In essence, if you look at it from a bird's eye view, it's a gang war for a criminal empire on this random planet that we've seen a ton of times before. And yet the plot was so convoluted and so uninteresting in how it delivered on that concept. It could have literally done anything that it wanted, and yet it chose to do the least interesting thing imaginable. So the main characters of the Book of Boba Fett, there's not that many. There's really only like a handful, one of them being Boba Fett, obviously, one of them being Shan, and then I guess if you want to say there's another main character or primary character in the show, I guess you could say it's the Mandalorian. Now, when you're doing a show like this, when you are talking about a character that we don't really know that much about, but that people really like, the whole point of making a show and like a series about him specifically is to explore the character more, things we don't know, so that we can better understand him. But apparently Disney had other plans for that. After watching the show, I have like no fucking idea who Boba Fett is, what his motivations are, or just like how he operates as a human being. We essentially go from like ruthless bounty hunter Boba Fett, who has to be told not to disintegrate people, to Union leader Boba Fett, who wants to rule a criminal empire with loyalty and fairness. We didn't know a whole lot about him in Empire, and somehow the show still seemed to contradict that very little bit of information that we already had about this character. There's one particular episode that this show wants us to think of as the reason why Boba Fett has changed as a person, and that's the second episode of the show, which focuses primarily on a flashback of Boba Fett's experience with the Tusken Raiders, who enslaved and have kept him with their little tribe in the time between Return of the Jedi and this show. Boba Fett was captured by this Tusken Raider tribe, was taken in as a slave. They treated him like actual garbage, and because he saved like a Tusken Raider child or something from some slug monster in the desert, they decided to treat him more as an equal. The show does this weird thing where it knows that we don't like the Tusken Raiders because we've seen them do some shitty things in the past. So what they do is they try to like insert this little dialogue or information in this episode where they suggest that this particular tribe of Tusken Raiders are not like the really bad ones. And my thought when I hear this is like, no, that's fucking stupid, because they're still enslaving people and working them to death. Are we supposed to feel bad for them? No, they're still assholes. Like, slavery is still fucking bad, right? So I think they want us to feel bad for the Tusken Raiders when they die, which I didn't because I'm not an idiot. And Boba Fett is supposed to be sad, apparently, with the people that enslaved him dying. You could use this as a life-changing event that maybe changes his perspective on how he treats people. This is also supposed to take place earlier in time than the events that we see in The Mandalorian Season 2. And in The Mandalorian Season 2, he's still like fucking shooting people constantly and still acting like the Boba Fett that we know from Empire.
What kind of Malian teeth be?
It seems to me that Boba Fett has just kind of changed to be more empathetic and loyal and trustworthy just because the show wants him to be that way, but doesn't want to put in the effort to actually show us why he is different. So another thing that kind of irks me about the depiction of Boba Fett in the show is that this man talks way too fucking much. I know that sounds like a weird criticism for a show that's supposed to be about Boba Fett, but hear me out. So first of all, this goes against pretty much everything that we've seen from Boba Fett's personality, because this man has been shown, even in the very limited screen time that we've seen him, to be this reserved, calculated, silent but deadly bounty hunter who would rather shoot at you than talk to you. He isn't walking around spouting off his every fleeting thought to anyone with an earshot because he's just not that kind of guy. So having him go around vocalizing his intentions with every possible story beat in the Book of Boba Fett is really out of character for Boba Fett, because he's been shown to be the exact opposite of that in prior films. His willingness to talk and have meetings with everyone and every single goddamn person in this show is like the least Boba Fett thing I've ever seen, but for some reason, most of the content that we get about Boba Fett in this television show is showing him arranging to have meetings with various people. And not only is this very out of character for Boba Fett, but I also think in general that the way the story constantly makes Boba Fett talk about what he wants to do and what he's thinking, what he's feeling apprehensive about today, totally removes the very thing that made Boba Fett interesting in the first place. Boba Fett to me was so intriguing, and I think to a lot of people as well, because of all the things that we don't know and see about him. He's a really mysterious and reserved guy. I mean, until this show, we don't even know what he fucking looks like under the mask. We just know enough to get a sense that he's dangerous and that he's really clever and competent, and that's really it. But the fact that we can't tell what he's thinking makes him all the more interesting to see what he does next. But by having Boba Fett constantly vocalizing his emotions and thoughts like he's in court-ordered therapy makes the mystique of Boba Fett kind of ruined. And I think that's why people have a hard time getting invested in the show, because now Boba Fett is no longer interesting and mysterious, but rather he's a guy that just makes really silly faces when he's fighting and talks a whole lot about his feelings. So as far as other characters go in this show, we have Shan, our good buddy Shan, who we saw in The Mandalorian. We know a little bit about her. She's this skilled assassin lady. I was kind of hoping to see a little bit more about her, but it seems like her character purely exists in The Mandalorian to deliver exposition and to just be the assistant of whatever Boba Fett needs her to do. We don't know anything about her. She just kind of like acts as his executioner in a way, but really doesn't have any personality of her own. It's also really strange to me too that she seems to have such a similar personality to Boba Fett. They're both kind of like, they just both seem kind of humorless and kind of straightforward, no nonsense, logical people. There's nothing to kind of contrast their personalities and make their interactions even the slightest bit interesting. It's just exposition versus exposition, and they're just kind of going at each other. So in terms of Mandalorian in these episodes, definitely think they were more interesting. I mean, watching the Mandalorian limp for 30 seconds down a hallway was probably more interesting than any scene with Boba Fett in it throughout this whole series. I do think that his involvement in this show in general felt a little bit out of place. It was kind of like, yeah, Boba Fett was in The Mandalorian, so we can technically now include The Mandalorian in the Book of Boba Fett, but we're going to include episodes that have literally no involvement to anything that Boba Fett is doing in his own narrative. Just made the whole story with Boba Fett and what he was trying to do seem even less significant and less important, because it just seemed like an excuse to transition to something completely different, to establish the third season of The Mandalorian without any regard to wrapping this up or having any sort of like continuity between the two storylines, other than the fact that like they previously worked together on a prior mission. Grogu and what's going on with Luke has literally no relation to what's going on with Boba Fett, and so the fact that we're like switching back and forth between that just felt like a bit of a cop-out. Like I said, I wasn't complaining that much because it's not like I was dying to go back to whatever was going on with Boba Fett. However, I think just in terms of how they were like combined together, it just felt like a bit of a strange decision in the story. We have like Luke, who, I mean, we obviously know Luke from the other films, but this was just a slightly more terrifying looking version of Luke, who is also a little bit more boring than regular Luke, a little bit less animated, but also more animated, if you know what I mean. So overall with the characters, I think that it's just a bit of a missed opportunity. I mean, again, if you're insisting on making a show that is named after a particular character and we already don't know a ton about that character, you better do a whole hell of a lot to explain why we should have a show dedicated to this character and give us more information about them, so we're walking away feeling like we didn't just waste our fucking time. So I spent like 2 hours attempting to film this yesterday, and when I went back and looked at the footage, I realized that I sounded like a bit of a babbling idiot. So we're gonna try filming this again. I need to finish this video. I cannot stress this enough. The longer it's gonna take for me to get this up, the more likely it is that Disney is going to release like 7 or 8, Star Wars spin-offs, and then I'll have to do videos about how stupid those ones are, and then it'll just be a revolving cycle of hell. But first, I got a new tattoo. I'm very excited about it. It probably looks backwards right now because I always forget to flip the footage whenever I do video edit. It was very painful. I took this Sanoderm off in the shower. You know what? We don't need to, we're wasting time. Okay, so let's just get the fuck into this, shall we? This is probably what I need right now. Hold on. Okay, let's do this. One thing that's kind of interesting with Disney that I feel like I just want to acknowledge, they've been doing a lot of like television shows, not only for Star Wars, but for Marvel as well. What's interesting with Disney is that it actually has the budget to be able to crank out all of these television shows and still make a very, very big profit while having the quality of a multi-million-dollar action adventure film in these television shows. I think in a lot of ways Disney is definitely a cancer to society for many reasons. The fact that it can do that and take the excitement and the action and the way that everything comes together in such an interesting and cool way from a movie and insert that into television shows. I think that's kind of interesting. I think it's kind of cool. I think with Boba Fett, even though there's a lot of very big flaws to this show, the way that it looked and the way that it felt and the quality of the production, I think was pretty good. And I think that that's something that you can see that's consistent with the Disney television shows, whether or not you think that they're good. One thing I will say with Disney too, in terms of CGI and special effects and things like that, I do think the Disney era of Star Wars has definitely taken a important cue from the prequel films by not putting somebody in a blue screen room and saying, okay, we're gonna just add everything in afterwards, just like act out your scene. Star Wars has definitely learned its lesson with Disney in not doing that and using sets, using people in costume, using people with like intense makeup to make them look like something completely different rather than just CGIing ones and zeros into the scene after the fact. And I think that makes a big difference in how actors interact with their surroundings, how it looks, how it comes across, because no matter how good you think the effects are now, they're probably not gonna look quite the same 20 years later when they inevitably get better. And I like the fact that you use puppets. You know, Baby Yoda is not a CGI atrocity like Yoda was in the prequel film. I can't not mention, you know, DH Mark Hamill / Luke Skywalker. At certain angles, it looks a little terrifying. I will say that it looks way better than anything that they did in Rogue One. So regarding like the stunts and the action sequences in this film, now I actually thought that this was something that the film would excel with. I thought that if anything, when you make a film or make a TV show about Boba Fett, this would be something that you would put extra attention to and extra focus on because he's a bounty hunter. The show didn't have a lot of action, and while I'm not saying that I need to have a ton of fights and things like that in my shows that I watch, it would have made sense, I guess, for this character, and there wasn't a lot of it. And when there was action scenes, they were terrible. The scene where he was under the assassination attempt by the mayor in like the first or second episode, you can see there's like 8 guards surrounding him and Shan, and they're all attacking like one at a time because they don't want to attack too fast because they know that the guy that plays Boba Fett cannot physically keep up with them. It just looks terrible. I don't know if it's just because the actor that plays Boba Fett is a little bit older and can't keep up, but in that case, why don't you just slap the helmet on him and then just have somebody else do his stunts to make it look better? Most of the fight scenes that he's involved in, except for the end battle, have him with his helmet off, and you can tell he clearly is like belabored to try to get through everything, and then they end up beating the shit out of him anyway. So I was kind of surprised, kind of disappointed. I think if they had put a lot of their effort into making that stuff look good, I would have maybe understood a little bit more the shortcomings of like the plot and the characters, because sometimes people make content that's meant to be enjoyed as like, oh, here's really interesting action scenes and really intense battles, like, I don't know, like the Fast and Furious movies. They don't watch it because of the plot, they watch it because you see a car flying out the window. With this, I could have understood maybe a little bit more if that's what the intention of the show was, but it seems like that wasn't even the point. It again brings me to wonder, what is the point of this show? Who is this for if even the action scenes and those intense moments aren't even executed well? There is a time and place for everything, including fan service. To a certain extent, it is like a necessary evil, right? Because especially for a thing like Star Wars, where you have set things in this universe that you know exists, you need to have certain things look a certain way, certain things happen a certain way for continuity, right? So it's not something that's like a terrible thing. And even if it's not for continuity, even if it's just for like a little wink and nod to a fan, like a little Easter egg, I'm totally fine with that too. People are fans of things. And when you reference something and invoke a positive memory to something that people already know, kind of like a little reward and a kind of like a little we see you and we appreciate you. If you're a fan, you'll really know this reference, for people that have been fans of your content for a very long time. So there's a difference between what I just described, fan service that is meant for continuity and meant for just, you know, little hints here and there, and having references and rehashing material that already exists to the point that it is so stifling and overwhelming that it has a negative impact on every aspect of the show. I think every issue begins and ends with fan service, and I know that sounds very dramatic, but I will explain myself momentarily. So if you sit down and think about like, what do we know about Boba Fett based on not the expanded universe, none of that stuff, but just basically on the film canon? He's a bounty hunter. He worked for Jabba the Hutt. He has a father from whom he was cloned, who is the most inept bounty hunter in the universe. He likes to kill and shoot people. He has a jetpack, and he rides a ship called Slave One. Basically, that is the core elements to the Book of Boba Fett. everything I just described, all those things that we know about Boba Fett, that's essentially what the Book of Boba Fett's plot is. Even if you look at it from a bird's eye view, like you gave a 1 or 2 sentence description of what the Book of Boba Fett is about, the fact that he's taking over Jabba the Hutt's criminal empire, it's still reverting back to one of the major only things that we know about Boba Fett. He's taking over his old boss's empire at a place and at a location that we already have seen before. It's not to say that you can't do that, but it seems like the show just kind of stuck within the confines of those 4 things that we know and was too afraid to branch out. That little bit of information is not enough to keep a show going. It's not enough to create something that's interesting. Look at, like, you think about the concept of what a film is. It's just looking at a person's story at a certain snapshot in their life, and especially with Boba Fett, we know alarmingly little about him. It doesn't show your entire life most often, especially in this particular situation. It just shows where you are and what you know about a person at a certain point in time. And rather than like maybe using that as guidance but then expanding upon that, Disney just kind of takes that and is like, okay, well, this is their defining quality for the rest of their fucking life, apparently. Things that happen at a certain moment in your life do not define everything about you, and Disney seems to think that it does. His association with Jabba the Hutt, the only and the most important thing about him? Probably not. Why can't we see what happened with him before all of the shit went down in The Empire Strikes Back? Why can't we see a more interesting story that we have no knowledge of whatsoever? And whenever the show does try to stray away from this main core of things that we know about Boba Fett, it gets way too bogged down in this convoluted exposition about this crime war that they're having on Mos Ipsar. If you cannot stray too far away from the things that we already know, and when you do, it gets convoluted and boring, maybe this is a story that isn't worth telling. If you have to rely so heavily on these things and you refuse to move away from them, then why are we even telling this story? What's the fucking point? And I mean, I've talked about this before, you know, with how we have to stay on Tatooine. It made the story not quite as engaging or interesting. The fact that we have Bib Fortuna coming back for some reason, even though he died. From high level to low level references to Star Wars where it's just eye rolling. And it's just like, okay, we've seen this shit before. Show me something different. The show also definitely shoehorns in 2 very obvious future spin-offs that we're going to have for the Star Wars canon, which is the one lady, Akshan. That's a league champion. That's not her name. You know who I'm talking about, with the blue and white horns, and the one that was from the Clone Wars. And also Cad Bane, the guy with the eye. I have very little knowledge as to who the fuck these 2 people are, other than from memes that I've seen people post on Reddit. But I know that they're both from the animated series. I know that people very much like both of their characters. I actually thought Cad Bane was kind of a cool, interesting character. I wish that he would have been more of a prominent villain. Their presence in this show, much like Akshan or whatever the fuck her name is, was in The Mandalorian, felt purely just for the purposes of setting up a backdoor pilot for their individual series on Disney. And while I think it's fine to introduce characters with the intention of spinning them off for future installments, I know Marvel does that all the fucking time, you still have to make their participation in this show relevant. And this was one of the things I didn't like about The Mandalorian with this Akshana. Her name's Akshana, okay, we're just gonna go with it. She was just kind of there for an episode, and then now she's here working with Luke, but then she's not working with Luke, so it's like, why the fuck are you even here? It's to remind the audience, oh yeah, we're gonna do a spin-off, so don't forget that she's also involved in this timeline. And then with Cad Bane, he showed up at the second last episode, shot 2 people that I cannot remember what their involvement is in the show, and then he got killed by Boba Fett, or at least I'm assuming he got killed by Boba Fett. He probably didn't, though, because he needs to have a show as well. Their involvement in the overall story was minimal. If you took them out of the show, it probably wouldn't make a whole lot of fucking difference. So why are we including them now? Oh, because we want to, because Disney keeps looking at what they want to do in the future. What more projects can they spin off rather than focusing on what's happening in the present? And you even see that with the Mandalorian storyline. Like, I genuinely like the Mandalorian as a television show, and I like him as a character. While it was exciting for me to see him, clearly you're just doing this to set up the 3rd season. The way that he is integrated into the plot, why is the Mandalorian even bothering with this? Because Boba Fett helped him with one thing, so now he has to help him, and his storyline is completely detached from anything that Boba Fett's doing, and he didn't even appear in those episodes. So it's like, why are we having this all occur in the same season? We talked about a lot of stuff, a lot of them not necessarily positive feedback. However, it wasn't a completely joyless experience watching the Book of Boba Fett. In fact, there were quite a lot of humorous moments that made me genuinely laugh out loud. So I've put together a little bit of a compilation of things that made me laugh while watching the Book of Boba Fett. So roll the tape.
Jabba ruled with fear and
intend to rule with respect.
I am not a bounty hunter.
Does the Book of Boba Fett answer the age-old question, so fucking what? My professional opinion is that no, it does not. This was not a story that needed to be told. This is something that sure you could touch on in maybe one of Disney's, 7 or 8 spin-offs that they have in the works, maybe for like an episode or 2. It doesn't give any insight into who Boba Fett is as a character. It doesn't give us any insight into what's going on at this point in time in the universe, at least nothing different than what we already know. It doesn't introduce or develop upon new or interesting characters. It doesn't show any interesting action or fight scenes or stunts or anything that's even just visually interesting or engaging. It doesn't even try to tell a new type of story in the Star Wars universe. It doesn't go for the more gritty criminal underworld type of angle that I think a lot of people were expecting. I think at some point along the way Disney probably realized that they didn't really have a lot to go on and that it wasn't really an interesting story, and you can tell at that point that that's probably when they started adding in the very long flashbacks that don't really relate that much to the present, and adding basically 1.5 episodes where Boba Fett isn't even present in the story at all. And for a show that's supposed to be, again, about a certain person, to do those kinds of things, I think it shows just how weak the concept of the story was in general to begin with. I have a message for Disney. Fucking stop. Just stop. It needs to die. It needs to stop. Disney has essentially beaten Star Wars into the ground to the point where I think even the most die-hard fans could give a damn about what Disney releases in the franchise. If you insist on continuing this nightmare of the Star Wars franchise, just pick your battles. Think about whether it would hold water if it didn't exist in this already established multi-billion-dollar franchise. Thank you guys for watching. If you like this video, make sure to like and subscribe, and let me know down in the comments what you think of the video, what you think of the Book of Boba Fett, and if you think my video was garbage and my review is garbage, then I disagree with you because I have the only correct opinion on the Star Wars franchise. I am going to go play with my cat now in the meantime because otherwise she's going to murder me in my sleep, so okay, bye.